Good evening, Truth Seekers North East.
Good evening.
Good evening. Tonight we've got author extraordinaire John Hamer, and he's going to talk about the falsification of climate change. And in the second half is a special treat because you've been so good. You're going to get to talk on Churchill. So I don't know if you like Churchill or not, but by the end of it you might not.
Oh, absolute hero.
I am. And I'm going to let John explain about the presentation tonight.
Yeah.
Okay, it's all to you.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks very much, first of all, to Maureen for inviting me up here, and for everyone who's made the effort to come out to watch me this evening. I'm very, very grateful. It's an honour to be here. I don't know how many of you know what Maureen's told you, but I had a bit of a disaster with my laptop last week. I was backing up some files and the computer crashed and I've lost all my PowerPoint presentations except two, fortunately. So the one I was going to do tonight on climate change doesn't exist anymore, and of course it takes days to do the damn thing, so I didn't have time to redo it. So what I've done is, for the first half, I'm going to talk about climate change using the chapter from my book on it. So I'll read some of it verbatim, and other bits I'll just kind of skip and go through, you know, using it as notes really. So I do apologise for that, but hopefully it won't detract from the enjoyment any. So for those of you who don't know me, never seen me before, never seen my work before, as Maureen said, my name is John Hamer. I'm a geopolitical researcher, author, geopolitical analyst, full-time. I don't have a job. This is me. This is what I do. And just to give you a little bit of background as to how I came into this truther world, for want of a better explanation, or want of a better phrase, should I say. It began for me in 1997 with the death of Princess Diana. And what happened to actually turn me on to what was going on in the world was that I had a friend who was in Paris the night that she died. Now, she'd been out with a partner for a meal, like you do, gone back to the hotel room, switched on the TV, and the first image she saw on the TV was of Princess Diana walking into the ambulance. Right? Walking into the ambulance. Right. Now, she wasn't given to flights of fancy. She wasn't lying to me. I knew she was telling the truth because I knew her. And of course, as a lot of you are probably aware, what tends to happen when there's any kind of an incident like that, the very first news reports that come out are often the most accurate ones. But then what they do afterwards, when they realise that that little bit didn't fit the agenda, they pull it. So that's what happened. This was shown in Paris on French television at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And then you never see it again. I mean, this happened a lot on 9/11, as some of you might be aware. Lots and lots of footage that was taken originally was pulled. So that kind of got me thinking anyway. And I thought, well, if they're lying about that, what else are they lying about? So I started doing research, and then a few years later, obviously, 9/11 came along, and that really put the tin lid on it for me. And I just thought, yeah, this is not right. And by pure coincidence, about 2 months after 9/11, I got made redundant from my job in IT, and I couldn't get another job. So it kind of went from there. I started writing articles for websites, and then I decided, well, let's put them all together and make a book. And that was my first book, The Falsification of History. So it just went from there, and you know, I'm on my 7th book now. So yeah, so this is what I do. So anyway, without further ado, and I do apologise for this, it's not what I normally do, but I will just read about the great climate change hoax. So, if everyone's sitting comfortably, I'll begin. That's for the older ones amongst you.
I don't know what you mean.
Okay, right. The debate about climate change is finished. It's over. Climate change has now been categorically proven not to exist, as confirmed by one of the world's leading climate authorities. And despite what establishment and media talking heads and institutions, such as the Royal Society, Wikipedia, the National Geographic, the Meteorological Office, and other countless so-called environmental groups have to say on this topic, you know, these organisations and others of a similar ilk a little more, as we probably all realise, the mouthpieces for the elites, scientific mafia and the powers that be. John Coleman, who was co-founder of the Weather Channel, shocked establishment so-called academics by insisting that the theory of man-made climate change was no longer scientifically credible. Instead, what little evidence there is for rising global temperatures points to a natural phenomenon within a developing ecosystem. And in an open letter attacking the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, he wrote, this is John Coleman, and I quote, "The ocean is not rising significantly. The polar ice is increasing, not melting away. Polar bears are increasing in number. Heat waves have actually diminished, not increased. There is not an uptick in the number or strength of storms. In fact, storms are diminishing as well. I have studied this topic seriously for years. It has become a political and environment agenda item, but the science is not valid." End of quote. Coleman also said that he based many of his views on the findings of the IPCC, which, by the way, is a non-governmental international body of scientists aimed at offering an independent second opinion of the evidence reviewed by the IPCC. The IPCC, incidentally, is 100% a political organisation and not a scientific one, as they tell us. Although it does include many scientists, but we can only assume that these are fully paid up members in more than one sense of the word. He also had it for good measure, and again I quote, "There is no significant man-made global warming at this time. There has been none in the past, and there is no reason to fear any in the future. Efforts to prove the theory that carbon dioxide is a significant greenhouse gas and pollutant causing significant warming or weather effects have failed. There has been no warming over 18 years. The IPCC argues strongly that their research shows it is certain that man-made global warming will lead to extreme weather events becoming more frequent and unpredictable. And of course this is what we're seeing on TV all the time now, isn't it? They're really hammering at us with all these fires and, you know, extreme temperatures that they keep quoting. You know, but perhaps more significantly, big businesses now fully engaged and actively responding to climate science and data. The US, along with the UK and other developed countries, well, developed, you could argue about with that one, is expected to pledge further actions on climate change very soon, all of which contributes to the ongoing lie. And since I wrote this piece, by the way, I've heard murmurings, and some of you may have too, that the next phase in this plan that's ongoing now with this COVID nonsense are climate change lockdowns. Yeah. So, you know, we certainly won't be out of the woods for a long time yet, unless things change dramatically. Okay, climate expert William Happer from Princeton University in America fully supported Coleman's claims. He said, and I quote, "No chemical compound in the atmosphere has a worse reputation than CO2, thanks to the single-minded demonisation of this natural and essential atmospheric gas by advocates of government control and energy production. The incredible list of supposed horrors that increasing carbon dioxide will bring the world is pure belief disguised as science." End of quote. Is it not the case that an abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually beneficial in at least one respect? I mean, which gaseous compound is it, again, that feeds and nourishes all plant life here on Earth? In much the same way as oxygen sustains all animal life? Please remind me. Oh yes, I remember now. It's called carbon dioxide. Of course, surely then is not a plentiful amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in fact a positive thing, leading to a good, healthy environment for the growth of plants and trees, you know, those large, sprawling green things that in turn excrete the very oxygen that we need to sustain us and the entirety of the rest of the animal kingdom. Well, one would assume so at any rate, but not so according to the lying scaremongers of the completely politically biased and controlled IPCC. And of course, demonising CO2 also does the same to humanity by instilling guilt in we CO2 exhaling polluters. In order to actually achieve the absurd, and they really are absurd, zero CO2 emissions, footprint goals, we would all have to stop breathing and walking, which is no doubt what our masters would prefer that we do anyway. The current asphyxiating mask mandates brings us one step closer to that goal also. The 2010 Inter-Academic Council Review was launched after the IPCC's hugely embarrassing 2007 benchmark climate change report, which contained alarmist, exaggerated and even wholly false claims that the Himalayan glaciers could melt by 2035. And where have we heard all these scaremongering stories before?
I don't think so.
However, climate change proponents remain undeterred in their mission, ignoring numerous recent scientific findings indicating that there has been no warming trend at all for nearly 2 decades. The godfather of this global warming scam, Al Gore, whom many believe to have been given the role of worldwide promotion of the entire scam in return for being cheated out of the presidency by Bush the Lesser in 2000 due to voting irregularities, again we've heard that story before, predicted among other dire consequences the melting of polar ice on a massive scale. These predictions have without exception proved utterly false. In fact, in 2014, a year that was proclaimed as being the hottest ever in the Earth's history, there were record amounts of ice reported in Antarctica, an increase in Arctic ice and record snowfalls across the world. On top of these inconvenient truths, the White House's assertion that 97% of scientists agree that global warming is real has been completely debunked. Several independently researched examinations of the literature used to support the 97% claim found that the conclusions were cherry-picked and misleading. More objective surveys have revealed more realistically that there is a far greater diversity of opinion among scientists than the global warming crowd would have us believe. A 2008 survey by 2 German scientists, Dennis Bray and Hans von Storch, found that a significant number of scientists were sceptical of the ability of existing global climate models to accurately predict global temperatures, precipitation, sea level changes or extreme weather events, even over a decade. They were far more sceptical as the time horizon increased. Other mainstream news sources, besides the National Review, have also been courageous enough to speak out against the global warming propaganda. Even the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed piece in 2015 challenging the anthropogenic global warming pseudoscience being promulgated by global warming proponents. And of course there are more than 33,000 American scientists to date who have signed a petition challenging the climate change narrative, and 9,029 of them hold PhDs in their respective fields, I beg your pardon. But of course, Al Gore and his lackeys have also ignored that particular inconvenient truth too. What a shock. Many of the scientists who signed that petition were likely encouraged to speak out in favour of the truth after retired senior NASA atmospheric scientist John L. Casey revealed that solar cycles known as Grant solar maxima and minima are largely responsible for warming and cooling periods on Earth, not human activity. But the global warming proponents continue to push their agenda on the gullible public whilst lining their cavernous pockets in the process. So this is what it's all about, isn't it? If you're still inclined to believe the gospel according to Saint Al Gore on global warming, please consider the fact that since he embarked on his crusade, his wealth has grown from a reported $2 million in 2001 to well over $150 million in 2020. Nice work if you can get it. largely due, of course, to investments in fake green tech companies and the effective embezzlement of numerous grants and loans in support of his utter lies and complete distortions of the real facts. As stated above, 2014 was supposed to have been the hottest year ever recorded. If this were actually true, all the terrible catastrophes predicted will be happening right now. But in fact, the exact opposite is happening. The Earth is actually beginning to cool dramatically as we enter the latest grand solar minimum. And of course, the utterly deceptive climate change agenda blends suspiciously neatly into the tenets of Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. Strange that. And of course, in the hottest year ever of 2014, there was record sea ice in Antarctica. In fact, a global warming sponsored expedition managed to become stranded in it. The irony. Arctic sea ice also made a huge comeback in 2014, and the Great Lakes in North America experienced record levels of ice too. Lake Superior only had 3 completely ice-free months in 2014. You'd think that in the hottest year ever, that ice would be melting, just as Al Gore said in his ridiculously highly risible hit piece, The Documentary An Inconvenient Truth, which for the sake of painstaking accuracy really should have been entitled An Extremely Convenient Lie. In 2014 we experienced all kinds of cold records. Surely, in reality, there should have been all kinds of heat records broken in that good old hottest year ever. 2014 also saw record snowfall in many areas. It was not too long ago that the deceitful, lying climate change crowd said that global warming would cause snow to disappear altogether, and that children will not know what snow is. Laughable stuff, but consider how many people actually believe this garbage, and the similar lies, and metaphorically how before the altar of the church and bow before the altar of the Church of St. Al and his faithful flock of adherents. And these faithful apologists, the believing masses and the scientists promoting the global warming climate change myth, when confronted with evidence of record cold winters, actually claim that global warming is also causing cooling via its ability to somehow create extreme weather events of all kinds. Yeah, it's a good laugh, isn't it? Conveniently blaming any type of weather event on global warming. How logical is this? Not at all. And you may think that polar bears would really have been in trouble in 2014, the hottest year ever, but they are actually thriving. And remember the emotive photographs of polar bears apparently stranded on remote ice floes and allegedly in danger of drowning, all designed to gain your emotional support for this fake agenda. A small point maybe, but a valid illustration of how we're all being conned by these people and their extravagant lies and distortions is the myth of imminent polar bear extinction. According to Dr. Mitchell Taylor, who has been involved for decades in the research on polar bears in northern Canada, this is absolutely untrue. They are in fact experiencing their highest numbers for almost 60 years. The famous photograph of the 2 polar bears standing on an ice floe, did we all see those pictures? Yeah. Implied to be in danger of drowning and used by Gore to promote his infamous documentary, was in fact taken by a lady by the name of Amanda Bird, who publicly stated, to no avail of course, that those particular bears were in no danger whatsoever. In fact, polar bears, far from being in danger of drowning in these situations, are known to be capable of swimming for up to 250 miles at a stretch when seeking out new food supplies. Al Gore actually predicted that the world's ocean would rise 20 feet by 2100. But the latest data demonstrates that we're currently on track for around 2 inches. Really, Al?
Got the 2 right, didn't he?
Indeed, most tide gauge meters show no rise in sea level whatsoever, and almost none show any acceleration over the past 20 years. A few years ago, the moose population in Minnesota dropped rapidly, and of course the gore worshippers immediately blamed global warming. That is, until a study proved that it was actually wolves that were killing the moose. Wolves have already been removed from the endangered species list and are now themselves endangering other species. So the state of Minnesota instituted a wolf hunting season, and the moose numbers are now beginning to return to normal once again. Indeed, the years in which the moose populations actually decreased were some of the colder ones. You may have heard it repeated over and over again that 99% of scientists believe in global warming. Well, the exact opposite is true. That figure is derived from a study in which only 75 scientists said that they believe in global warming, whereas more than 33,000 scientists from all disciplines have signed a largely ignored by the mainstream petition stating that they do not believe in catastrophic man-made global warming. And in 2014, NASA launched a satellite, if you believe in that stuff, that measured CO2 levels around the entire Earth. They had assumed, or maybe hoped, before the results were analysed, that most of the CO2 would be emanating from the highly industrialised areas of the Northern Hemisphere. But much to their surprise, and no doubt disappointment, but quite naturally, the results proved unequivocally that the vast bulk of it was actually being produced by the rainforests in South America, Africa and China. Now, I don't know, just an aside from this, but I don't know how many you've heard just recently. There's been a report in the mainstream saying that the rainforests are now responsible for this global warming because they're producing so much CO2. Did anybody say that?
No.
I can't remember which rag it was
Don't
in.
listen to the mainstream.
No, I don't. I have one concession to the mainstream, and that is MSN News. Not because I like it, but because it's actually the worst of everything. So I click on that every morning and see what garbage they're coming out with today, you know. So it was in there. Yeah.
Aren't they saying now that cows are contributing as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I was born.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Lost my place now, sorry. There's provably been no global warming due to any cause for more than 25 years. The reason the IPCC is able to state that 2014 was the warmest year is because they were using the ground weather station data, which is heavily influenced by the urban heat island effect, affecting many of the stations which are on or close to paved areas, which naturally reflect and magnify heat rays of the sun. Even then, they still had to cherry pick that data to produce the deceptive figures, and it was still only the warmest by only 2/100ths of a degree within a data set that has a variability of 50% of 1 degree. The fact that they had to ignore accurate data and fudge sketchy data to justify their figures and therefore their agenda alone proves, in my considered opinion, that climate change is a hoax. Another factor that clearly points to global warming being simply an elaborate hoax is that the main purveyors of climate change, falsehoods, have lifestyles representing the total opposite of what they preach. They all own multiple large homes and yachts, and they fly around the world in private jets pushing their propaganda, not to mention the fact that many of them actually personally profit from the many carbon taxes and other green energy laws. If they actually believed what they were preached, they would surely be leading quite different lives. The global climate change industry is worth an annual $1.5 trillion, and that's according to the Climate Change Business Journal. That is the equivalent of $4 billion a day spent on really vital stuff, such as carbon trading, biofuels and wind turbines. Don't get me started on wind turbines, that's a whole other topic. Or in other words, it is almost precisely the same amount that the entire world spends every year on online shopping. It's all pure propaganda. But there is a not so subtle difference between these two industries of global warming and online shopping. When we go online shopping, no one is holding a gun to our head. We do it through choice or even necessity, but we're buying those things entirely of our own volition. either for ourselves or for someone we love. We've paid for them with our own money because we have made the personal decision that they will make our lives a little better in some way or another. On the other hand, when we buy from the climate change industry, we have no choice in the matter whatsoever. It's already built into the tax element of purchases, utility bills, the cost of petrol, the cost of airfares, and indeed the cost of every product we buy and every service we use. This expenditure is utterly inescapable. Yet, unlike online shopping, we get precisely zero in return. But of course, who does benefit from this scam? I don't believe I need to point that out again. But in reality, it is much worse than that. We receive less than nothing. We have things forced upon us that we really do not want. Those hideous monstrosities known as wind farms. Those birds slaughtering eco-monstrosities belight the landscape, slashing property values and contributing almost zero to the sum total of energy generation, whilst making a huge killing for certain vested interests. Huge swathes of solar panels where wheat and other crops used to be grown or where we used to walk. Letters from our local councils expecting us to be grateful for the fact that we now have to separate our rubbish into 7 different recycling bins rather than the previous 1, whilst notifying us that they're only going to collect our regular rubbish once every 2 weeks now instead of weekly. Cultural Marxism influenced teachers who fill our heads with junk science, eco-friendly propaganda such as happened at my youngest child's school when his class was shown the disgraceful propaganda-filled hit piece An Inconvenient Truth, and thereby defying the UK High Court direction which had recently decreed that it was not to be shown in schools due to its mass of scientific inaccuracy and lies. Free parking spaces for electric cars which we don't own but which we subsidise for richer people who do. Feel-bad nature documentaries about how it is all the fault of we humans that certain things, including countless numbers of animal species, may soon disappear forever. So-called energy-saving light bulbs that take our nocturnal homes back to the kind of gloom that Western civilization thought it had bidden farewell to in the 1890s. So-called yawning gaps where forests used to grow but which have now been cut down and chipped to create biomass for burning in power stations which used to run more cheaply and efficiently on coal, and so on and on and on ad nauseum. And as regards the chief proponents of the scam, here are some of the people who benefit substantially from this 1.5 trillion climate change industry in the loosest sense of the word, of course. The carbon traders, the bought and paid for academics, the vulture capitalist classes feeding greedily on the bloated carcass of renewable energy, the environmental NGOs, the environmental consultancies who specialise in providing expert testimony at planning appeals, arguing on the most spurious grounds, aka lying, that the bats and birds and other wildlife in the area are not going to be affected by this wonderful new wind turbine farm they're proposing to build. The sustainability officers at every level of local government, the green advisors attached to every business who advise them how to reduce their CO2 count, and last but not least, the PR companies that specialise in green awareness. Et al. These people do not deserve a single penny of our money, but they nevertheless receive plenty of it. I mean, I don't begrudge anyone the right to earn a living, just so long as they're providing someone, somewhere, with something they actually need, i.e. a valued product or service. Not a single person working in the climate change industry fulfills this criterion. Not one. If all the above jobs were scrapped tomorrow, the world would not suffer in the slightest, and science itself will be all the better for it. You may argue that there is some kind of trickle-down effect, as the money we are forced to pay these utter charlatans and oxygen thieves via various taxes and tariffs feeds back into the economy. But you could make the same argument were these people paid the same amount of money by the government to perpetually dig holes in the ground and then proceed to simply fill them all in again. All of which would be a vastly preferable use of taxpayer money, because then these utterly useless parasites will be reminded every day how pointless the work they perform actually is. Whereas, as things are, many, if not all of them, suffer under the ridiculous delusion that their green non-jobs are somehow really virtuous, important, and saving the planet. The section heading of this particular section refers to the climate change industry as being a hoax. That is simply because on any objective level it certainly is. This does not necessarily mean that the scientists and business and politicians promoting it are all abject liars, just most of them. Even if it means that in order to keep earning their livings they have to be dishonest with themselves about something they know in their hearts to be untrue. Alex Epstein, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, clearly states the fundamental problem with the climate change industry, and I quote, "Increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04%, which is what's actually happened, has not caused and is not causing catastrophic runaway global warming. Dishonest references to 97% of scientists equate a mild warming influence, which most scientists agree with, and more importantly can demonstrate, with a catastrophic warming influence, which most don't agree with and none can demonstrate." This succinctly sums up the situation. If you accept the validity of that statement, and quite frankly, how could you not, it is unimpeachably accurate and verifiable. Then it follows that the $1.5 trillion per annum and growing global warming industry represents the most grotesque misuse of manpower and scarce resources in the history of the world, simply to benefit a small few powerful, greedy, vested interests. Right. Sorry, I just need to take a breather. Here's another quote, and this is from Patrick Moore again, who was the founder of Greenpeace, not Patrick Moore the astronomer, the guy who founded Greenpeace. Okay. And I quote, "And so you've got the green movement creating stories that instill fear in the public." Where have we heard this story before? "You've got the media echo chamber, fake news, repeating it over and over and over again to everybody that they're killing the children, and then you've got the green politicians who are buying scientists with government money to produce fear for them in the form of scientific-looking materials, and then you've got the green businesses, the rent seekers and the crony capitalists who are taking advantage of massive subsidies, huge tax write-offs and government mandates requiring their technologies to make a fortune on this. And then, of course, you've got the scientists who are willingly compliant. They're basically hooked on government grants. When they talk about the 99% consensus among scientists on climate change, that's a completely ridiculous and false number. But most of the scientists, put in quotes, scientists, who are pushing this catastrophic theory are getting paid by public money. They are not being paid by General Electric or DuPont or 3M to do this research, where private companies expect to get something useful from their research that might produce a better product and make them a profit in the end, because people want it, build a better mousetrap type of idea. But most of what these so-called scientists are doing is simply producing more fear so that politicians can use it to control people's minds and get their votes, because some of the people are convinced, oh, this politician can save my kid from certain doom. It's taking over science with superstition and a kind of toxic combination of religion and political ideology. There is no truth to this. It is a complete hoax and a scam. As I said, that was a quote from Patrick Moore, who was the founder of Greenpeace. Excuse me. Makes your mouth dry reading. Out loud, of course. Right. Have you noticed that the original term of global warming has now disingenuously and surreptitiously been replaced by climate change? By most commentators and reporters. This is presumably because it's now been demonstrated beyond all doubt that the Earth is currently entering a period of cooling, aka a grand solar minimum, which is expected to continue for the next several decades, which will probably see me out. Indeed, this is all part of a natural cycle of warming and cooling that has been ongoing for millions and millions of years. The utterly ridiculous and easily disproved fantasy of man-made global warming by CO2 emissions is nothing but a gigantic hoax. It's a confidence trick designed to extract even more money from we the people in the form of taxation to further line the pockets of the already super wealthy. There are other powerful factors at work here too. Climate change, as we now must refer to it in our increasingly politically correct world, is also being used to justify the ongoing centralisation of power. Surprise, surprise. Deindustrialisation, the passing of global laws, and then expansion of the surveillance of the world's population. All as part of the inexorable march towards the much vaunted New World Order. This is also another major example of the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis, technique. Artificially create a problem, wait for a demand for action, and then provide the solution you wanted to see implemented in the first place. By that simple, subtle method is the agenda advanced step by step by step. So, enter Mr. Al Gore, fresh from his planned defeat at the hands of Bush the Lesser in the 2000 presidential election campaign. I can just imagine the scenario right now. Rothschild. Sorry Al, but Georgie boy is our choice this time round. But don't worry, we have something even more important lined up for you. We want you to front this massive campaign that we've thought of to make us all even more billions. Basically, we're going to employ a whole bunch of scientists, corporations and politicians to falsely promote the fact that the Earth is suffering from some kind of runaway warming and that the only solution that will save mankind will be draconian measures that will stop it all. Of course, this will cost every single person on Earth an absolute arm and a leg. But never mind, just think of the money. What do you say, Al? Will you do it, Al? You know it makes sense, Al. Gore. Yes, of course, Mr. Rothschild, sir. Of course I will, sir. Only too delighted, Mr. Rothschild. When can I start? So, Gore embarked upon his quest to convince the entire world that the Earth is warming dangerously as a result of excessive CO2 emissions, all, of course, funded by the Rothschild millions. One of his first actions was to produce the aforementioned horrendously scientifically inaccurate, replete with lies film, An Inconvenient Truth, which became the third most successful documentary in history and unsurprisingly won the Oscar for Best Documentary that year. Gore's book of the same name also reached the top of the bestsellers list in America as the public fell for his scam, hook, line and sinker. And furthermore, as if this were all not enough, and to add insult to injury, Gore was subsequently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this great work of fiction. Please bear in mind that this is the same Al Gore that Philip Eugene de Rothschild referred to thus, and I quote, "Bill Clinton has full-blown multiple personality disorder and is an active sorcerer in the satanic mystery religions. This is also true of Al Gore as well. I have known Clinton and Gore from our childhoods as active and effective Satanists." End of quote. Incidentally, and as also alluded to above, in the early 2000s, the Inconvenient Truth documentary was distributed by the government to be shown to teenagers, one of which was my child, in all schools in Britain, despite a High Court judge ruling that it was too full of unscientific accuracies and gross distortions of the truth to be shown to highly impressionable young people. But the law matters not a jot, of course, to the perpetrators of this hoax. Laws are only there to be obeyed when it is expedient for their agenda to do so. Otherwise, they may be ignored at will, and perhaps even more tellingly, the psychological damage has now been done and the purpose of the film has been served. No matter how much proof of its distortions and inaccuracies may now be forthcoming, falsehoods it portrays are now firmly established in millions, if not billions, of human psyches all around the world. This then, of course, renders the refuting of all its false information much, much more difficult. Of course, any conscientious person realises that protection of the environment is vital to long-term human, and indeed all life's very survival on the Earth. But that's not the real issue here, despite the fact that it is disingenuously portrayed as being so. climate change theory is based on the complete myth, or even downright lie, that global temperatures are inexorably increasing solely due to the levels of CO2 emitted by human activities, whilst the real truth is that from the 1970s to the early 2000s, the Earth was actually undergoing a short period of naturally induced warming as part of a normal cycle of sunspot activity, also known as a grand solar maximum. This trend is now rapidly being reversed, as we are now entering a sunspot-induced period of cooling. But of course this irritating fact, for them, does not figure too prominently in the warmist agenda, and they therefore deny, but mainly ignore, this particular inconvenient, for them, truth. All their warming predictions are based on totally unscientific premises and selective data derived mainly from the old computing principle of GIGO, which is an acronym for garbage in, garbage out, which roughly translated means that if the initial data input is incorrect, then the resultant computer predictions based on that data will also be incorrect. It's falsely claimed by these grand-scale con artists of zero morals that it is the excessive amounts of this so-called greenhouse gas, CO2, emanating from vehicle exhausts and industrial processes, especially those of the third world, that is the root of the problem. According to their shills, useful idiots and downright unscrupulous professional liars, this excessive CO2 is collecting in the atmosphere and preventing the natural escape of heat into space, and thus causing a build-up of warm air all around us, and that is the issue. Of course, we're now being extolled to become carbon neutral and partake in the carbon offset scam. Just as many companies that wish to cause pollution are now able to buy carbon credits from those who do not exceed their stated carbon emission limits. What a farce it all really is. So essentially what we're being told is that it's okay to cause pollution as long as you pay for it. And where does all that money go, you may ask? Well, lucky for us, of course, Al Gore has set up a company to facilitate it all. And it's called Generation Investment Management, and it's based in London. So in effect, Gore and his cronies can buy their carbon offsets from themselves. Better yet, Gore can buy them with the substantial payments he receives from his long-term relationship with Occidental Petroleum. It's so easy to be carbon neutral. All you have to do is own a gazillion stocks in big oil, start an eco stockbroking company to make eco-friendly investments, use a small portion of your oil company's shares profits to buy some tax-deductible carbon offsets from your own investment firm, and you too can save the planet, whilst making a fortune and leaving a carbon footprint roughly the size of Godzilla's, as at the beginning of the movie when the main characters are all standing in the big toe imprint wondering what this strange depression is in the landscape. So please, please never ever submit to the blatant confidence trick now being perpetrated by some airline companies. That'd be a chance to be a fine thing, wouldn't it? That's so, this was written a little longer, that so thoughtfully and generously invite you to buy your carbon credits when paying for a ticket. This is nothing but a highly lucrative fraud being perpetuated against us all through the emotional blackmail of saving the planet. At the time of writing, these airline carbon credits are voluntary, but in line with the totalitarian tiptoe, it is probably simply the prelude to more and more taxation, even more Orwellian controls, and perhaps more importantly, to prevent the developing nations, the third world, from gaining a share of the profit gravy train currently being enjoyed almost exclusively by the first world and the likes of Gore and his elitist cronies. In 2006, an offshoot of the United Nations, the International Panel on Climate Change, the aforementioned IPCC, began to inform the world that global warming is the direct result of human-caused carbon emissions. It has since become the de facto truth, along with many other lies, that carbon emissions are warming the planet at an unsustainable rate, despite the now proven fact that the Earth is now, as I keep saying, entering an intensive period of cooling. However, please note that the IPCC, again as I said before, is not a scientific body at all. It is a purely political organisation with its own agenda and replete with all the bias inherent in all such organisations. Yeah, the IPCC's claim that it represents 2,000 plus of the world's foremost scientists is a downright unadulterated lie. Its report purportedly had the backing of all these scientists, most of whom are blatantly and deceptively named within its covers. However, since the publication of this huge fairy tale masquerading as the truth, at least 60% of those named scientists have formally protested in writing at the inclusion of their names within its pages, all of which were used without their express permission, and indeed many have demanded that their names be specifically excluded from it, all of which has fallen, of course, upon deaf ears and as usual remained unreported by the compliant media. The IPCC report is, simply put, a document replete with lies and distortions compiled to support a predetermined false agenda and designed to fool the public into believing that which is not true. In this, at least, it's been a raging success. So, we're constantly being fed the line that the Earth is now warmer. I'm getting there now, don't worry, it's not going to go on forever. We're constantly being fed the line that the Earth is now warmer than at any time since records began. Sounds impressively foreboding, doesn't it? However, upon hearing statements such as that, it's worth remembering that records only began as recently as 1914, just over 100 years ago. This is yet another example of the depths of deceit and outright propaganda to which the warmists do not hesitate to stoop in their constant battering of our senses to drive home their messages of abject doom and gloom. As stated previously, the Earth is subjected to constant and ongoing fluctuations in the warming and cooling cycle that has been in evidence for hundreds of millennia, and a mere 100-year period taken in isolation forms no statistical basis whatsoever upon which to base correct, unbiased, significant data. Then, in late 2009, came another extremely important nail in the warmists' coffin with the exposure of the ClimateGate emails. Do we all remember the ClimateGate emails?
Yeah.
Yeah? Some of you. Okay, yeah. Right. Upon reading the 1,000 plus emails and 72 leaked documents, it becomes immediately apparent why the East Anglia Climate Research Unit in the UK would have wished to keep them under lock and key and away from the prying eyes of the badly misinformed public. Here are just a few snippets below as examples of how the warmists have faked and manipulated data to further their own ends, as have been revealed in these highly incriminating documents. These are all in quotes. I've just completed Mike's trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, i.e. from 1981 onwards, and from 1981 for Keith's to hide the decline. Another quote. The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. The CERES data published in the August 2009 supplement on 2008 shows there should be even more warming, but the data is surely wrong. Our observing system is inadequate. Can you delete any emails you may have had with Keith re AR4? Keith will do likewise. He's not in at the moment. Minor family crisis. Can you also email Gene and get him to do the same? I don't have his new email address. We'll be getting Casper to do likewise. Phil and I have recently submitted a paper using about a dozen NH records that fit this category, and many of which are available nearly 2,000 years back. I think that trying to adopt a time frame of 2,000 rather than the usual 1,000 addresses a good earlier point, that it would be nice to try to contain the data, even if we don't have a hemispheric mean reconstruction available that far back. And it goes on, I won't read it all out, but it's in a similar vein and it's all replete with in-jokes and in-house references, but those few examples provide us with an overall flavour of exactly what was going on. And despite the reluctance of the mainstream media to cover it in full, with a few noteworthy exceptions, I think that demonstrates pretty conclusively the institutional deception taking place in order to perpetuate the hoax. How much more evidence do we need for us to realise that the whole concept of global warming by human-caused CO2 emissions is a monumental fraud, carefully designed and perpetrated to further enrich multimillionaires and billionaires. I'm going to skip a little bit here, because it's largely Okay. Since 2003, however, when the statistical methods used to create the hockey stick, have we heard of the hockey stick graph where they show the temperature going like that, you know, the shape of a hockey stick. Okay, so yeah, so I'll read that again. Since 2003, when the statistical methods used to create the hockey stick were first exposed as fundamentally flawed by an expert Canadian statistician, Steve McIntyre, an increasingly heated battle has been raging between supporters calling themselves the hockey team and McIntyre and his own allies, as they have ever more devastatingly called into question the entire statistical basis on which the IPCC and CRU construct their flimsy, misleading case. I'm trying to skip through it a bit now because I don't want to bore you all to death. Okay.
I'm not bored, John. Show some graphs.
I am. Okay. The third shocking revelation of these documents is the ruthless way in which these academics have been determined to silence any expert questioning of their findings, not just by refusing to disclose their basic data, but also by discrediting and freezing out any scientific journal which dares to publish their critics' work. It appears that they are prepared to stop at nothing to stifle scientific debate and indeed totally falsify science in this way, not least by ensuring that no dissent in research should ever be made public. Back in 2006, when the eminent US statistician Professor Edward Wegman produced an expert report for the US Congress vindicating Steve McIntyre's demolition of the hockey stick chart, he excoriated the way in which this same tightly knit group of academics seemed only too keen to collaborate with each other and to peer review each other's papers in order to dominate the findings of those IPCC reports upon which much of the future of the US and world economy may hang. In light of the latest revelations, it now seems even more evident that these men have been failing to uphold those principles which lie at the heart of genuine scientific inquiry and debate. Already one respected US climate scientist, Dr. Eduardo Zurita, has called for Drs. Mann and Jones to be barred from any further participation in the IPC due to their fraudulent claims. Even previous supporters, horrified at discovering their betrayal by the alleged experts they revered and cited for so long, called for Jones to step down as head of the CRU, which is the Climate Research Unit. The former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, upon launching his new think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, rightly called for a proper independent inquiry into the maze of skullduggery revealed by the CRU leaks. But the inquiry actually mooted to be chaired by Lord Rees, President of the Royal Society, that well-known Freemasonic institution, also as himself a shameless propagandist for the warmist cause, is very far from being what Lawson had in mind. Our hopelessly compromised scientific establishment cannot be allowed to get away with a whitewash of what has become one of the greatest scientific scandals of our age. And so to conclude, yes, we're there, yes, unfortunately it's all a huge hoax. Corporate junk science at its finest, and a sordid game to convince us that we are in danger of imminent disaster from the slightest warming of the planet, and the only way to prevent this will be to give even more money to an already wealthy elite group who care nothing whatsoever for the planet, for you, your families, despite maintaining a thoroughly deceptive pretense to the contrary. That's it. How long did that take? It's about just under an hour, was it?
Any questions and answers?
Yeah, please ask questions
Questions
if you
and
like.
answers?
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer.
Okay, along.
No guarantees.
Is there anybody else present not talking here?
Yes.
Yeah, John Barrow.
That joke comes in as a joke.
It's wonderful, it's fine.
Not the best joke, but
Richard will be assistant.
What happened at the BBC? When did they change the BBC?
What do you mean? Were they
No,
once?
no, I'm talking about. I've just heard a story about something called the BBC 17. There was they had people like David Bellamy, and they were quite open. And then overnight, the policy changed, and there was some kind of investigation as to who was this panel, who were they, and they tried to cover them up. But it came out that somebody went on a Wayback Machine and found out who they were, despite the fact that the BBC had spent a lot of money trying to cover up who these people were. And hardly anyone were scientists, they were just like politicians. Do you know anything about that story?
No, I don't actually, but the IPCC, as I kept saying in that bit now, it's just a political organisation. They pretend it's a scientific one, but it's political. Yeah. But I don't know if any of you, the older ones among us, remember the 1970s when, this is what I thought you were referring to originally, but in the 1970s the BBC was pushing a massive agenda of heading for the next ice age. Yeah. Do we all remember that?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know when that turned on its head, but it's certainly probably 80s, 90s. But the BBC just go along with whatever agenda they're told to go along with. You know, they don't make the decisions themselves. They're told, right, this is what you're going to push now, guys. You know. So.
Yeah. Was it?
Oh, sorry, go on.
Was it not the case that David Bellamy got finished
Yeah.
in the BBC for saying there was no such thing as because he was a poster boy? And then as soon as he said global warming doesn't exist, that was the last anybody heard of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
He died.
Got his cards then.
He died as well, though.
Well, it happens to so many. I mean,
When did he die?
I just know.
Yeah, but he's...
Yes, sir.
Did you read the latest IPCC report?
I must confess I didn't. No, when was this?
It's just been released. It's quite comedy. I agree with what you're saying about the sun, absolutely.
Yeah.
It just completely ignores the sun, it disregards everything about it.
Yeah.
It's quite funny if you read it.
Well, yeah, I can imagine it is quite funny because, I mean, you know, you'd think that warming or cooling would have plenty to do with the sun, wouldn't you? I mean, you know, this is the big thing that controls the temperatures, really, isn't it? You know?
You just have to scale the Earth to the sun itself to realise what's controlling the temperature.
Yeah.
But do you think that, sorry, it's kind of a segue to that question. Do you not think it's still a bad idea to burn fossil fuels?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I mean,
I completely agree about the carbon dioxide myth. You know, it's we'll just have bigger trees, it'll be much better. But at the same time, it's still pollution. It's still kind of bad to burn these things. You just have to look at Stoke-on-Trent in the late 1700s and early 1800s. No, it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
There's not that much high quality coal. There's like really crap coal out there.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't want to sound like I don't care about the earth. Of course I do. You know, but what I was trying to get across in that is that it's not what they say it is. You know, this is just a political agenda. It's now to do with saving the earth and you know, looking after people, and it's all about making money for the elite cronies.
Well,
that's all
otherwise
it's
they
about.
wouldn't have this HS2 or whatever it is. They wouldn't be getting rid of the ancient woodland. And
Exactly.
if they cared so much,
they don't give
wouldn't
us
be doing
stuff,
that.
do they? No, not at all.
Do you go along with the 400-year cycle? Every 400 years it's cold?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that evidence. Yeah.
David Dubai knows that 2030. He goes on about that.
Yeah.
So does Ice Age Farmer.
Yes.
And guy from Oppenheimer Ranch Project.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, there are lots of different theories, aren't there? But
I know 400 years ago, there's pictures of the River Thames.
They used to have frost bears,
which is good. So when you can say to someone, "Oh, every 400 years it freezes," like. You can quote that, it's like, no, because most people have seen it. Well, that would be sample size of 20 people that, so like most of them have seen the River Thames. But what I'd like to know is, I want evidence to say, was it cold 800 years ago? What's the evidence to say it was cold 1200 years ago, 1600 years ago, etc. And then just be able to rattle them off, and then you kind of like.
I know.
That's what I'd like.
What they use to determine that, whether it's just utter bollocks, I don't know. But the tree rings. The growth of trees, they can tell by how big, they say that they can tell by tree rings, how much trees grow in any given year, and the wider the difference between each ring, the warmer it is, because the trees thrive better in warmer weather, obviously.
All these things correlate with magnetic excursions as well, which correlates to activity from the sun.
Okay. Yeah.
I've heard of comments as well.
About 25, might be 30 years ago, I was shown a map of the New World.
Sorry.
And when it's underwater, Scandinavia had disappeared, France had disappeared, the Bay of Bengal had disappeared. So I don't know, did you ever see it?
Perhaps not that specific one, but I've seen other similar things where it shows like the New York skyline and the water's halfway up the skyscrapers. I mean, it's just all...
But then...
Anybody can make a picture like that, can't they?
Yeah, but then later I was thinking about it and I thought to myself, well, we are shown maps of the world, but are we being shown maps of the world?
Oh,
is that what it looks like?
Well, no, what we see is Mercator's projection, isn't it? That flat map is Mercator's projection, which the world doesn't look at all like that. Whether you believe in globe Earth, or whether you believe in flat Earth, or any other shape of Earth, the world does not look like that, and that's Mercator's projection. It's just a convenient way of displaying all the different countries and their relationship to each other, but it is highly inaccurate. The sizes of a lot of the countries are totally inaccurate in relation to the others, but whether that has any significance to the topic in question, I don't know.
What's your view on the, apparently there was a little mini ice age, wasn't there, about 16? Is it 16? Well,
yeah, 1600s. So there was like the Thames froze every year and stuff like that. Yeah.
So is that?
It's just part of the normal warming, cooling cycle. Yeah. I mean, real scientists reckon that, going back to like the 11th, 12th, 13th century, that it was, the Earth was 3 degrees warmer then. This is the 3 degrees that they keep going on about and saying, oh my God, it's warming by it was 3 degrees warmer in 80 years. And I go, well, I won't be here, but great, bring it on.
Do you know why we tend to associate Christmas with snow? Because when Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, when he was a boy, that was the time when they had the mini ice age in the early 19th century. So I don't think there's been snow at Christmas for about 200 years or something, apart from that little period. But because he wrote the story, everybody associates Christmas with snow.
Just because you tend to get
How do you feel, I don't know if you'll know this, but how do you feel that China, etc., fit in that they've got 160 new coal-fired power stations that's planned to be built in the next few years? Where's that fit in with the IPCs? Because we're going one way, they're going...
Yeah, and this is what they're trying to eradicate. This is what partly, not wholly, far from wholly, but this is partly what I believe they're trying to eradicate. They're trying to destroy the third world, which China is kind of a part of. I know it's becoming more and more industrialised and more modern now, but they certainly don't want the African countries and the Asian countries to catch up to the Western world. They see their profit markets as sacrosanct, so they're using this as well as many other things to actually put in place sanctions on the third world so that their emerging industries can't compete with the West. So that's kind of how I believe that's connected.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does, but it's... I can't see how they can let China get away with it and keep the whole show on the road.
Well, what can they do other than attack them? They won't want to do that, would they? I mean,
No, they wouldn't want to do it, but even some of the mainstream media are on to the fact that Chinese got these power stations and India's got some going as well. What's the point of where cutting hours where 2% in places like China are 20-odd%.
Yeah, but you got to remember as well though that I mean none of it makes any sense. Just like this shite that's going on, none of it makes any sense really.
That might be deliberate anyway, because the world needs an enemy in order to perpetuate its fiat currency.
Well, that's true.
And this is what China is always the bad guy since
good point.
The Cold War. Or a COVID war.
Good point.
It's just the same as the climate change. It's just another way to rob the world.
Yeah, there is.
But can I follow that up with a question, John?
Of course.
And I'm going to plug your book, The Falsification of History, because I got that a few years back and it was excellent. I wish I brought it to get it signed. I think I went to my sister. However, Do you write about, in your new book on the climate change, do you write about Greta Thunberg at all? Or have you got any comments?
She gets a mention. I think I refer to her as the little Swedish bitch, I think I call her. But I mean, the Thunberg family, you know, they're heavily into eugenics. I don't know if anyone knew that.
No, not are they into eugenics?
Yeah, a mother and father are staunch, prominent eugenicists, yeah.
Commented on
And
it.
that's well shown.
Well, wouldn't the Chinese